Today we're going to be talking about one of the wildest bike parts I've ever had the privilege of testing. So come along for the ride, open your mind, and let's see if the Be More Bikes raised and reverse stem is really as crazy as it looks. So just looking at this thing, it's a bit hard to take it seriously. It looks ridiculous and it's such a departure from what we're used to seeing on the front of our bikes. And when I first got on it to ride, it felt kind of like a circus act. You're so high up and it's so different, but as soon as I dropped into the trail and hit a few corners, it really started to blow my mind. Oh wow, that was crazy. Oh my God. Oh, what? Dude, this thing is nuts. On my second or third lap, I found myself going just as fast as I was on my previous setup, if not faster. There's some serious merit to this design. After spending some time on it, there's definitely some drawbacks too, but it's always exciting to see people kind of on the forefront of bike geometry and technology, and I think this is a worthy experiment. It's worth talking about and it's worth taking seriously because you don't know until you try something new, and I definitely learned a lot riding this stem. So let's get into it. So the stem itself is 150 millimeters of rise with a negative 15 millimeter reach. And this puts your hands in a much higher position and much further back. So Bronson claims this position on the bike comes with a ton of benefits. His argument is that it's better than your normal riding position in almost every way. And I think there is a lot of merit to what he's saying, but it does come with some drawbacks. But immediately the positives you get by being in this upright position is just a ridiculous amount of confidence in the steeps. You're so far back on the bike and your bars are so high, there's just no hesitation or question in your mind that anything's gonna happen to send you over the front wheel. So that just allows you to really focus on the trail, even in really steep and rough terrain that would traditionally maybe give you a bit of hesitation. The other thing it does is it puts almost all of your weight on your feet instead of your hands. And it feels like your hands are there to just steer and lean the bike, and they're not actually supporting any weight. This makes it really efficient to ride. I don't feel hardly any fatigue or effort coming into my upper body. Like I'm never really in that push-up position and like taking impacts like that. All the force is going through my feet, which is a really interesting sensation. And I do think that comes with some drawbacks, which I'll go over later, but it's definitely a positive in a certain sense. What that also does is it allows you to ride with really bent arms, and it essentially gives you way more arm travel and way more articulation with your upper body, whether that be to lean the bike or push it into compressions. And especially on a bike like this with a longer reach and a more stretched out riding position, I think it comes with benefits, but with a normal cockpit setup, you are just a little bit more stuck and you just have less, articulation to give with your body to do the different things on the bike. So with this, you have more leverage and more room to work with to manipulate the bike in different situations. And the other thing it gives you is a massive amount of leverage over the rear wheel to bunny hop, to manual, to throw the rear end around. Especially on this bike, I think is a really good pairing for the stem because it's a massively long wheelbase. It's got a really long chainstay. It's a 457 chainstay, 522 mil reach. I'm 6'1". So with a normal setup, that makes this bike pretty hard to throw around. Like you can bunny hop and manual it. It takes a ton of effort to overcome that leverage of the longer chainstay when your body's like pulled in a really forward position with that longer cockpit. But with this stem, I feel like it negates a lot of the negative attributes of that longer and more stable geometry. It just gives me so much more leverage to throw this bike around like way more aggressively because of that longer reach. Having the bars higher and further back, there's still room to operate in the cockpit, and yeah, it just seems to complement this bike, I think, more than it would a bike with a shorter reach and a shorter chainstay. I'll get to into this a little bit later, but I think it puts you in a really rearward position, and you kind of need a longer chainstay to prevent you from like falling over all the way back. So that was mainly how this stem affects the riding position, but what about the steering? It's a dramatically different steering feel and experience on this bike. I think the biggest thing I noticed was how easy it was to lean, and that again has to do with the height as well, but also something to do with the offset. Like on corners that I didn't expect to be super leaned in on, reviewing the footage, I was like really leaned over and really engaging these side knobs. Some corners I was dragging pedal on that, like, I don't know, I just didn't do that on a normal setup, and I seem to be cleaning the insides of ruts and the insides of corners a lot tighter. And I would say the biggest thing that I noticed, especially in tight corners, was the tendency of this to avoid the jackknife feeling. And this is one of Bronson's big claims, is that on a normal stem, you reach a certain amount of steering lock and then it almost reaches a point of no return. And I'm sure every rider can relate to this moment where the front wheel stuffs and then you kind of do the big push-up moment and you either go over the bars or, you know, do a big push-up and ride it out. And it felt like with this, there wasn't that hesitation of that moment where that might happen, and it just seemed to carve a tighter and tighter line into the corner. And yeah, on a normal stem, like there's sometimes a moment where you're committing to a tight corner where if your rear doesn't break loose and your front end goes in there straight, you're gonna get that stuff. I just never really had that feeling on the stem. And yeah, I was able to carve those really tight corners, I think, really well. So yeah, the steering characteristic is it's a wild sensation at first, but it was honestly pretty intuitive to get along with, and I kept just being surprised and blown away with it working. Like, it was a real trip. So it sounds like I've just been selling this stem, but there are some drawbacks. And when I spent some more time on this and really, you know, dialed in a trail riding this stem, I switched back to my normal stem and I was actually faster. So it was kind of a situation where I felt like when I switched to this, I was like, wow, this does so many things better than my normal setup. I feel like this could be faster. And then once I got used to this and switched back to my normal stem, I kind of appreciated the advantages that the normal setup gave me, and I actually was able to go faster on it. So it's kind of just a bit of trade-offs. And where I think you're making the main trade-off is the one characteristic of the stem that's a little hard to get around, in my opinion, and that's the twitchiness of it. With the shorter stem, the more sensitive your steering becomes, and I feel like with the riding position so far back, it was one, kind of hard to feel exactly what the front end was doing. And then if I was in a situation where I was making like little adjustments with my body to lean the bike or maybe get out of the way of a tree, the front end kind of had a tendency to wander and climb its way out of ruts. And I think that was especially a problem in lower speed scenarios. Once the bike got up to speed, I think the positive handling characteristics of the stem were more obvious. I was getting shot out of corners sometimes, like in a really backseat position, because, you know, it's putting you there by default. And then the steering would get kind of light and really twitchy. And I would have kind of a moment of hesitation where I didn't exactly know what the bike was going to do. And it was just a little more unpredictable. And then, like, yeah, going into sections that were really low speed, there were just times when I was having to like manage the steering and it didn't feel super predictable. But again, the higher speed corners, I feel like the better this bike rode. And then the other thing that's really hard for me to get around is the feel from the front tire. I feel like there is weight on it and there's grip. I just feel a lot more disconnected from it. And maybe if I rode this stem more, it would become more intuitive, but there's just a bit of a disconnect there, and it's hard for me to trust completely. I feel like you can trust it, but especially in flat corners, I feel like I was just like really unsure if the front end was going to tuck or wash wide. And it's a really hard feeling to describe, but when I went into those corners on a normal setup, I just had way more connection to that front wheel. I knew exactly where it was, and I was able to trust my line. I felt like on this setup, I sometimes would fall a little inside or fall, a little high, and maybe that's just due to the twitchiness of the stem. So I don't know, it's a trip. I think a lot of you watching are wondering like, oh, is it better? Is it worse? Is it garbage? Is this guy full of crap? I think he's not full of crap. It does work. It's just different, and it's not necessarily better or worse, but it provides some riding sensations that are a lot different than what I'm used to. It works incredibly good in some situations. It's a little hard to deal with in others, but there is merit to the design, and I think it's a really good experiment. I think maybe if it didn't have as much rise, and if it was maybe like a 0 degree, I think it would be really fun to play with stem options in that range to see if there's a happy middle ground. But I think this is definitely a really interesting concept to explore, and especially with the advantages you get out of a bike with a longer chainstay, a longer reach, and a longer wheelbase. I think this stem is a really good complement to that, and something in this realm could be what's mated to a frame like this to make a bike that really handles well and kind of negates some of the things that are hard to deal with when you get into this style of geometry. Personally, I think this stem has a lot more advantages and really could be a good fit for beginner or novices that are really nervous on more aggressive terrain, just because it's such a more confident position to be in when things get steep. I could see someone that's a little more timid finding a massive benefit in the downhill performance with this stem. I think for me, being a more experienced rider, and I'm not trying to brag, but I have raced a lot, ridden a lot at a high level, it's a feeling that comes with that, but it's not necessarily a performance advantage. Like in my timed runs, like, yes, I felt a lot more comfortable in the steeps, but it wasn't actually making me go any faster because I'm just used to pushing my limit to what the trail will allow, even with a normal setup. So it's not actually giving me a performance advantage. But someone who's being hindered by that confidence will find a lot more confidence and a lot more speed with this stem. And I think it has to do with the terrain you're riding as well. If I was riding really tight technical stuff that was a bit more lower speed, then I don't think that would necessarily play to its strengths, and I feel like it would be a little awkward. But if you're riding really fast, high speed stuff, and you want to be able to have confidence in the steeps and the roughs, and yeah, you have turns that keep your speed up a little more, I think this stem would perform really well. I also think, like I mentioned before, the bike you pair it with is really important. I don't think it would be as good on a bike with a really short reach and a really short chainstay, just because you're already so far back. If you don't have that longer chainstay kind of like planning you forward, I feel like it would be almost too rearward where you would be looping out more, and if your reach was really short, you would just be really cramped. Like in a few other reviews, touching on the climbing, they said that you would literally touch your knee on a shorter reach bike, but I didn't find that I was like really limited by that, and I had a bit more steering angle with that added room in the cockpit. And with the longer chainstay, climbing was definitely, I think, not as good, but it was manageable. Like, I wasn't looping out everywhere. I definitely had a tendency to be too far over the back sometimes, but you have to just kind of be a bit more conscious about being forward on the bike. But it wasn't you know, a total nuisance to climb. I think it just took a little bit more energy to fight to be forward on the bike. And you're kind of just like, it feels like you're in a recliner lazy boy seat and you're perched above all your friends, just looking down on them. So it's kind of an interesting experience. One thing you're not gonna avoid with this stem is a bunch of weird looks because it sticks out like a sore thumb. So that's my experience with the stem. Is it better? Is it worse? I think that's kind of for you to decide. There's definitely some merit to the design. I don't think it's the end-all be-all future of bikes, but I do see bike handling and geometry and stems leaning more into this direction or becoming more mainstream. I always like it when innovators are out there willing to stick their neck out and make something that's out of the ordinary. So I commend Bronson for making this, and you know, it's a unique design, and I'm excited to see where the future of bike geometry and components take us. And it would be really funny if, you know, 20 years down the road we're in this realm, but time will tell. So with that being said, thanks for watching. If you like the content, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next video. See ya.